Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 14th of October, and today we're looking at key updates from Vuhledar, Selydove, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and we'll finish off with the clarification on a lot of what's going on in Kursk, because you have now additional reports from both sides. Not as much geolocated footage. Some of that is due to the fluidity of the situation and some semblance of operational security, as a lot of the events that are unfolding right now, they're occurring across a large gray zone and in regions that really weren't prepared for it at this moment in time. And so we're going to give you guys clarification to the best of my ability. Also, we have to talk about the end of the video of Ukrainian efforts that have ramped up to evacuate parts of the civilian population, especially on the border of Sumy Oblast with, of course, the international Russian border. So now you have specific numbers as to how many civilians are being evacuated from those regions and the reasons for why. But let's begin by looking south of Vuhledar, because here you have Russian advance amounting to 4.9 square kilometers. You also have a minor advance as a part of a larger Russian armored incursion that occurred just south of this trench line that you see that I've discussed in multiple videos now. That's because the Ukrainians have this strong eastern flank, but once this line were to be overrun, for instance, the entire eastern flank, this entire region that is located on a local hill and generally is an open area, would provide the Russians with an amazing attack vector that would put significant pressure onto Vuhledar at an area where there are no defenses around its perimeter, and would also put a lot of strain onto the one supply line that is really supplying it directly, and that comes in from the paved road connecting Uspanivka to Vuhledar, which, if you look at the broader Ukrainian composition of forces, is relatively disconnected from the other local garrisons. Same would go for Ukrainka, for instance. Really only a few roads are connecting them, and they're being constantly bombarded. You have a huge uptick in aerial activity all across the southern Donetsk front, even going into Zaporozhye Oblast. But just to zoom in over here, you see that the advances also include this ridge over here, because north of Vuhledar, you also have this highly elevated line that goes diagonally in the northwestern direction, and it extends into the large open region that is just southwest of Vuhledar. And so this is another region that the Russians, of course, would be looking to attack through with armored assets, with the goal of overlooking the valley on which Vuhledar is located. Same would go for areas like Ukrainka, Maximyrivka, and all the paved routes connecting them in between. Based on the new footage that came out from the Ukrainian side, you could say there was a small advance by the Russian forces, and it gives you an idea as to where they're also going to try to infiltrate into the village itself, because you do have not that many specific roads to be utilized, but you do have paths that run along gullies or ravines, and one of them is over here. There's another one here, and this one actually does have a road attached to it. So there are two specific routes for vehicles that are being used. This one over here, the Ukrainians sensed an attack coming in from the usual Donbas 3 mine, and they were able to stop it in its tracks, leading to several vehicles being targeted directly with FPV strikes and creating a bottleneck, with a lot of them being either abandoned or destroyed. And so here you have, it's a video from the Selydove drone group. That's a drone unit attached to the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade. It's a unit from Poltava, and it's been active more recently in trying to, fill the void caused by some losses in the 72nd Brigade and the 79th Air Assault Brigade. So this territorial defense unit is now becoming more involved, and they're doing that in tandem with the 144th Infantry Brigade. Now we know where this unit is located, because I talked about it in some earlier videos, the fact that the Ukrainians had created a new series of units spanning from digits of 140 to 160. And one such example is number 144. We previously didn't know where it was, although it was probably operating on the border with Russia and maybe even Belarus. Now we actually know it's been integrated into fighting for the first time. So it's going to get its experience, its combat experience with these new recruits in one of the hardest parts of the front line at the present moment. Already the units like 141, 42, 43 have been integrated into other parts of the front line. I think 143 is around Luhansk. 141 is located in the Orkiv direction and played a role in filling the void of the 9th and 10th Army Corps being moved away from there last year. 142nd Brigade, new unit integrated into the Velika Novosilka sector, again, to help with a really offsetting the loss of huge amounts of units being moved elsewhere, and that occurred by the end of 2023. So now they've been there for a while, although Velika Novosilka hasn't really yielded them the most intense combat experience. Then you have the 150 series, so like 150th Brigade, which is operating around Toretsk. 151st and 52nd Brigades are operating around Pokrovsk, and the 153rd Brigade is not yet operating in any area that we know of, although it's hypothesized that they may be stationed on the rear in Kharkiv or in Sumy. So they may have some sort of ancillary role with the front lines over there. Nothing verified though. Now looking at Selydove, we now have Russian focus shifting to the southern outskirts of the city. So as you zoom in here, you'll see it's a video that was geolocated by Petrenko, marked along the Lozovaya ravine. This is a specific path that the Russians have been utilizing a lot. They've been concentrating a lot of their forces, specifically ground-based assaults with smaller squads, pushing through the forested areas, sometimes also using the road to guide them. And they really are knocking on that southern doorstep to Selydove, where you do have an entrance. And the entrance through which they're attacking, there were several, but one of them, which is really dangerous when you think about it, would be through these red arrows over here. And it would actually be an entrance into the western rear of Selydove, which would put the Russians in rather close contact with some of the western entrances to the city from Vishneva, for instance, and through a lot of these routes that are either on paved roads or through windbreaks just parallel to rail lines. So it really is an important Ukrainian interest to really create stabilization here, to send some of the forces that have done a good job in holding onto Mikhailivka and the Korochenka mine to also defend around here to the south, because also along this specific tree line, you do have a deep advance. It's one amounting to 43 hectares, but then when you look at the kilometer advance, it's nearly 1 kilometer. Here, it's actually a drone strike FPV on Russian soldiers that were advancing using the cover of the foliage. This is from the 15th National Guard Brigade. They're sort of split because the 2nd Battalion is operating further south in the city, or even further south in like Tukurnia, and the 1st Battalion of the brigade is involved with a lot of this fighting on the eastern outskirts of the city. Also, you have to keep in mind there is a paved route leading directly into the hospital region, and this is a region with also some more high-rise buildings that is important for securing control and having a great field of vision for the rest of the southern bank of Selydove, because Selydove is, of course, divided by the Solona River, and the southern portion is less well defended when you think about it more generally, both because the Russians are now advancing and have control over much of the heights overlooking it, but also because most of the structures here are one story. So the ones that they do have here, they really need to salvage. Also, recently, we've seen an activation, once again, of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. They've been sort of low-key. I don't think they've been at the front line as much, their squads, but I think they're being reintroduced now based on the frequency of videos being released by them. So they're, I think it's called Dovbush units. It's an FPV element. They've been really active, posting footage of their strikes onto individual Russian soldiers, generally near Tukurnia, sometimes south near the Basel mine or near Hirnik. Also a bit further north, they're posting footage from this region over here just west of Marinivka, because you do have a large open area that could be utilized to flank Selydove from the north. I'm marking with an X. It's on a slightly higher elevation than a lot of the entrances into the city, and it's sometimes on parity with the mines that the Ukrainians control, like the Korochenka mine. And so the Dovbush unit is now providing that support to prevent any ground-based advance in those regions. Also, you have reports of Russian DRGs attempting to advance towards Izmailivka, but nothing has come into fruition yet. Now, looking at Toretsk here, we just have a slight advance based on a video released by the Ukrainian Police Patrol Brigade. This is a part of Ukraine's national police formation, and this brigade is working in tandem with certain regiments of the Liut Brigade. So they released here footage of individual Russian soldiers being picked off by drones that drop grenades from Mavic 3s. And this is from October 10th, but it does indicate a slight Russian advance. Again, really chipping away at the basis of the core of Toretsk, trying to get control over this section of the center now, because a lot of the eastern parts, which includes high-rise buildings, pharmacies, stores, etc., it's already been taken over, and that means the Russians already have a solid foothold, which means that for the time being, you need a really large Ukrainian organized counterattack to push them out, which we're not seeing. Ukrainians really are on the defensive here, a lot of it being focused on drone-based defense. So the Russians, they feel galvanized to continue. And the next objective will be to get control over the remaining high-rise apartments in the Citadel region, which will give them the proper basis through which to begin attacks towards the high-rise, really important mines and factories. By doing so, the hope would be that they'd have huge control over these heights to dominate the remaining portions of Toretsk, which still would be very vast, but they would be completely engulfed by the Russian heights that they'd have under their control. So that's the thinking of the current very limited and concentrated Russian spearhead. And you can see that it yielded a relatively small advance recently. Now, looking at the Chasiv Yar region, Deep State is reporting on Russian advances amounting to, let's see the extent for itself, 1.26 square kilometers. This is across the Donbas Canal. Some Ukrainian sources actually allege that either the Russians never were able to cross over the canal in their efforts that occurred around mid-September, and that was done by Akhmat forces, or that by the early parts of October, the Ukrainian forces from the 5th Assault Brigade and perhaps certain elements of 93rd Brigade, if they were present here, were able to push them back. I don't know which one is true as of now, because there's still not been any proof provided to indicate that the Ukrainians are present in this region that I'm going to mark with the red perimeter, which is located west of the canal and also includes a dense forested region leading directly into heights in Stupochki. So it is important to understand what's going on over here, but we don't have any way to negate the current marking of the map. Only we have additional proof of further Russian advances based not only on Deep State's reporting, but also on geolocations. So you had stations here with the 5th Brigade and perhaps also the IDAR 24th Battalion, and that would be built along the canal itself, where you have embankments and very vast trenches, or also near windbreaks that are just parallel to the highway. So the Akhmat forces were able to cross over the dense regions, and that way they were not spotted by the Ukrainians initially, and they were able to overrun the Ukrainian dugouts, for instance, taking radios and equipment that was left behind. And based on the geolocation that you see over here, it lends credence to the idea that there was actually a force. We're talking about a smaller scale operation, but it does mean the Russians now have another foothold, and this one would actually make use of a road. It would also provide a sort of northern flank to push forward and overrun some of Ukraine's positions that are really well defended on heights, including on quarries and mines. But for now, the extent is yet to be determined, in the sense that we don't know how many Akhmat forces are actually being involved, whether it's just squads or it's becoming a company level sort of endeavor. Looking a bit northwards, the 24th Brigade continues to repel attacks. The Russians are really pushing forward in the Okhtybarsky district in the eastern part of Chasiv Yar, so there really is no development over there. But Deep State admits there was a Russian advance just south of Prihorivka, amounting to nearly 7 square kilometers. And this would be in an area that is adjacent to the Donbas Canal. It's not necessarily in high elevation. There are some regions here that are forested, and so they provide great axes through which to assault Prihorivka. But now the battlefield is really being shaped in a way that would make it difficult to hold on to this village because of the constant Russian bombardment, because the entrances are being taken over, because the flanks are being carved out by Russia, and because more generally the settlement is isolated. And it does provide the Russians, if they were to take it, with a forward outpost to begin launching flanking assaults onto Chasiv Yar from the north. So really, a lot of the reserves and a lot of the ground forces involved in the Chasiv Yar front were moved away, whether they be from the 109th or 106th, I should say, or 98th divisions. Those are VDV elements, of course, or even from the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. Those were all moved away. But despite that fact, the Russians do still have a operational reserve in this region, and it usually is activated whenever the Russians, they are able to find a localized breakthrough, and then the reserves are sent in to sort of capitalize off of that. So I have to see if the Russians try to continue either in the northern flank or southern flank. Looking at the Kursk offensive, here we have a more calibrated understanding with both sides are reporting on. So around Plekhovo, there are reports of advances by the Russians, and also a clarification that the Ukrainians are still maintaining positions east of the Psal River within Plekhovo itself. The Russians were able to, and this actually occurred later on in September, they were able to advance from Borky and Smolnoy, get control over some forested regions and local trenches that they'd built earlier on. and use them as forward outposts in order to provide more pressure onto the southern flank of the village of Plekhovo. Same thing occurred to the north. The Russians were able to advance southwest of Ulanok, cross over the river, and entrench themselves in forested regions. For now, there is still this Ukrainian salient located in this village, and it's really their final holding in this bridgehead area before they would, of course, be divided by the river. The Ukrainians, of course, have an interest in maintaining this buffer between the line of contact in the river because any successful crossing would put into a lot of danger Ukraine's rear south of Suja. You don't have that many villages here. It's a forested area, so in some sense it's good for defense. But additionally, there weren't many trenches built in the first place. The Ukrainians didn't really have the ability in such difficult terrain and in such a limited amount of time to extend whatever small fortifications the Russians had built. And so they will not be that well prepared for Russian attacks if they were to come from this region. And also the forest composition here is relatively small. So really all the factors would put it in a really huge amount of danger of falling into Russian hands, which would then, of course, galvanize Russia to attack across the border into Sumy itself, into the Ukrainian rear, into the supply lines leading into Suja, and then also move their focus northwards and attack Suja itself. That would be the biggest fear of all, because right now the Ukrainians are really hoping that there could be a protracted defense and an extended battle on the outskirts of Suja, and then, if need be, within the city itself. Now, you have also claims by the Russian side that they were able to capture Fanasivka. I can't confirm that right now. And as an extension, they also claim to have captured Cherkasskaya Konopelka, and the Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks in this region to stabilize the situation. I can't confirm it again, but if it were to be true, then it would again lend credence to this fear that the Ukrainians have of the Russians chipping away at their perimeter of Suja, because then it will really negate a lot of what Ukraine is hoping to do over the next half year or so, or even a couple of months in this particular region. If you're looking at, for instance, Ruskaya Konopelka, why did the Ukrainians push over here? Why did they do that? I believe it was in late August, early September. It's because they really understood that eventually the momentum would die down and that they needed to have a huge buffer east of Suja that the Russians would have a hard time running through in the first place. And that's why they tried to stabilize the line across this particular ravine, which would include, of course, Konopelka and Pushkarnoy. It did not end up succeeding. They failed in getting full control over the salient. And what this means is that the Russians do have forward attack posts that they can very readily use to advance even deeper into the Ukrainian line. And then from there, they'll be even closer to Suja, for instance. They'll be located on hills that overlook Suja. Even right now, they're only about, if you measure 5 kilometers away, so it's well within the range of, shorter range artillery and some mortars. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on, but it's not necessarily the main axis of attack right now. You do have claims that the Ukrainians succeeded in repelling large Russian assaults towards Pogrebki. If that were to be the case, then it would probably be a part of a concerted Russian effort to really force the Ukrainians out of all their holdings in this very, very large salient. The salient that is sort of like a triad because it connects between this Ukrainian push north of Pogrebki, this Ukrainian outcrop that is along the highway leading into Korenovo, and then also to the east, their positions near Malaya Loknaya. And so all of them would be under extreme pressure if the Russians would have succeeded in taking Pogrebki. But for now, the Ukrainians do still maintain control over there. You also have the Ukrainians discussing ambushes on Russian forces from the 155th Marine Brigade and Akhmat forces, VDV, all being targeted either on the highway or on foot as they advance through forested areas near Olgovka and Kremyannoy. And this is the thing, Ukrainian sources, they either mark these two villages as still under Ukrainian control partially or fully in a gray zone. And so it would not be that surprising to me if there are still some Ukrainian squads acting as pockets of resistance here. They are trying to do everything within their means to prevent a fall in this region. And by doing so, they're actually going out proactively in attacking Russian columns and troops as they're advancing along this one axis on the highway. And so I've revised the map as a result to indicate that there isn't really any strong control over here, that it still does remain fluid, although Russian sources do claim that at the very least Olgovka is under their control, while Kremyannoy is largely being taken by them. They also claim to have captured the village of Tolstoy Lug, Russian sources. They claim that there were 70 Russian villagers still in there during the time of capture. And that's certainly possible given the fact that the Russian forces are in control of Lyubimovka and Zeleny Shlaich. And so it would just only be logical for the nearby hamlet to also be taken over in the process. Ukrainian sources, they attempted to counterattack near this village, this hamlet, Zeleny Shlaich, along this highway, but were not successful in that endeavor. And Russian sources, they claim, although we can't confirm, that there is a near encirclement occurring of what they claim to be a battalion-sized force, which sounds, again, way too large for me, in this region south of Lyubimovka. Again, there is definitely a sort of bulge or salient or envelopment, whatever you may call it, but it doesn't look to me like a physical encirclement in its entirety. Definitely, this region, though, is under a lot of threats because it is not well defended. These are small villages with open areas nearby, with the Russians already having a lot of momentum. So there is going to be a lot of Ukrainian emphasis on trying to stabilize the front line over here to prevent further blossoming of the attacks. And that will include the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade. It will include elements of the 80th, 82nd Brigade, their drone units. 41st Mechanized Brigade is going to play a big role in this. So they're all going to be moved into this region to play a role and at the very least maintaining control of what they do still have marked as light blue on my map. And part of that would probably entail shifting focus away from the Glushkovo offensive, because now you have Russian sources claiming that the entirety of Ukrainian holdings in Medvedje, Novy Put, Obakhovka, Vesaloy are now back under their control, that the Ukrainians have withdrawn back across the international border, back into Sumy. It's certainly possible, but it's not confirmed. The units that were focused over here include elements of 47th Brigade, 21st or 22nd Brigade, Korn Group of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, and then the battalion, the 225th Assault Battalion. So that's a very strong core of forces that were supposed to be used in attacks towards Glushkovo. If they're actually going to be withdrawn, then it will make sense, because then you have a group of several battalions at the very least, if not more. So you could look at several thousand men that could then be redirected to defend what is currently still being held by the Ukrainian forces in the other parts of Kursk. Now, moving on, the Ukrainian local administration in Sumy has acknowledged that 37,000 residents have been evacuated from their homes, the vast majority of whom are within a 10-kilometer range of the border with Russia. This includes 6,400 children, and in recent weeks, the military administration has expanded the evacuation orders, and so in late August, that's when they really began with the efforts to request evacuations of certain people with an emphasis on children. And ever since that late August period, an additional 16,000 have been evacuated in addition to the 21,000 that had been previously evacuated from the border zones. And over the past week, you've had 143 children and 535 adults being moved away, most of them being moved to Kiev in Poltava Oblast. So Kiev Oblast is over here for you guys, and Poltava Oblast is actually nearby, just to the south of Sumy Oblast. And then on September 30th, they ordered the mandatory evacuation of children and their parents from within 10 kilometers of the border. Just for some reference, you can see here is this one piece of the border in an area where there isn't a Ukrainian infiltration. And you can see 10 kilometers that reaches pretty deep into the oblast. Again, these are more rural parts of the region. It's one of the least populated Ukrainian subdivisions out of all the ones that exist. It's down there. Sumy is one of the largest population centers, and it would not be under threat from evacuation orders. Neither would its suburbs, although there are some larger villages or towns that are located near the border where the Ukrainians currently infiltrated that are affected by this at the present moment. And then also moving northwards for some additional perspective on the scale of the evacuations. Here you can see 10 kilometers once again. I'll zoom in for you guys, and you can see that really it is focusing on some of those smaller villages. Those villages are dangerous for whoever's there, because the Ukrainian forces, a lot of them are moving through those regions as intermediaries. Sumy is, of course, the main logistics hub in this region, and then it runs through local deployment points and logistics points on the way. And those ones are being bombed incessantly by the Russians on a daily basis. You had actually in one day 34 aerial attacks on October 13th in this one Sumy Oblast, not even counting the rest of Ukraine, but just in this one region alone. And that's just a significant amount. It varies by day. Usually it's lower, but still that is significant. And then locals report hearing hundreds of explosions per day, whether it's some sort of gunfire or mortars, artillery being launched on Ukrainian positions next to the border. And so definitely that is a consideration, and it really is a reflection of the fact that Russia has been ramping up their attacks here. Also, of course, the fear that the Russians will at some point then turn their eyes to launching an offensive here. Again, that's something that's way longer term. And Syrskyi saying that there's 50,000 Russian soldiers in this region. That's not entirely accurate. It is likely an exaggeration because although the Russian force garrison here, when you're adding up the numbers, is over 30,000, that's there's a bit of nuance. It could be in between the number 30K and 50K. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the higher end. But definitely that is also a consideration that the Ukrainians are thinking about, not urgently based on the way in which they're carrying out the orders, but definitely it's been increasing in their conscience. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.